June 1944. Above the English Channel, a lone Messerschmitt Bf 109 cut through the morning clouds. The German reconnaissance pilot scanned the land below with a tired but vigilant eye. His job was simple: find the spearhead of the Allied invasion before it struck the coast of France. As he crossed the English shoreline, his breath caught. Beneath him stretched a massive airfield. Rows of fighter bombers parked wingtip to wingtip, with fuel dumps and maintenance crews bustling around them. He counted dozens, no, hundreds. This was it, the invasion force preparing to launch the next deadly blow against the Reich. He dove lower, camera shutters snapping furiously, capturing proof of what seemed to be a strike wing ready to take the skies. Every photograph confirmed what he feared. The Allies were building overwhelming strength just opposite the French coast. He broke radio silence long enough to transmit a single message: large concentration of aircraft, immediate reinforcement required. Within hours, his photographs were in the hands of high command. Luftwaffe generals demanded defensive operations. Hitler personally ordered units shifted to counter the threat. Troops and resources scrambled toward Calais, the place Germany was convinced would be the next Allied hammerstrike. The truth? That pilot had just risked his life to photograph balloons, inflatable planes, canvas and hot air, an entire army built not of steel, but of rubber. And the men behind it were not hardened soldiers or pilots. They were sculptors, artists, theater craftsmen. Men who painted shadows and carved tire tracks into mud. Their mission wasn't to shoot down enemy aircraft. It was to fool them. And in the deadliest war the world had ever seen, trickery might be the most powerful weapon of all. Before a single balloon touched the battlefield, the Allies realized something chilling. In this war, the side that controlled what the enemy believed controlled the battlefield itself. Bombs could win cities, but illusions could win wars. In 1943, deep inside England's wooded training grounds, a new breed of soldier was being assembled. Not chosen for brute strength or combat experience, but for imagination. They came from art schools and theater companies, from ad agencies and design studios. They had backgrounds in painting, sculpture, architecture, radio engineering, even Hollywood set construction. To the average general, they looked like misfits, dreamers. To the few who understood the mission, they were weapons. Weapons of deception. They were taught to disguise reality and invent danger. They learned how a shadow should fall across a fake runway, how to make a rubber wing look like aluminum, how to build tire impressions so real a pilot would swear a squadron had already taken off. Their motto: win by imagination. Soldiers with guns trained to kill. These soldiers trained to be believed. They became masters of sound, recording the rumble of engines and the clamor of ground crews, blasting it through forests to simulate entire air bases operating through the night. They became masters of space, constructing fake bases so quickly that German reconnaissance barely had time to process yesterday's intelligence before fresh dangers appeared. Every deception had one purpose: keep Hitler guessing, force the enemy to chase shadows while the real armies moved unseen. And so, as D-Day closed in and the fate of Europe hung in the balance, these unsung artists prepared their biggest show yet. A stage so vast that it would stretch from the coast of England to the bunkers of Germany. The audience? Hitler's high command. The stakes? The liberation of a continent. Under the cover of night, trucks rolled into the countryside of southern England, not carrying bombs or fuel, but balloons. In open fields near Dover, Kent, and Portsmouth, an army of artists went to work. They dragged out enormous bundles of folded canvas and rubber, laid them flat in the grass, and connected hoses with a hiss. Then, the transformation began. Large shapes rose from the ground, wings first, then fuselages. Then, the unmistakable silhouettes of P-47 Thunderbolts and B-26 bombers. Entire squadrons inflated like carnival attractions, except any German scout who spotted them from the sky would see only one thing: war. Wooden maintenance sheds popped up overnight. Fuel drums, hollow props painted to perfection were stacked along the taxiways. Jeeps carved tire tracks into fresh dirt. Crews stomped footprints into mud to mimic dozens of ground personnel. To an enemy camera lens, this place was alive. The balloon army was born. When dawn came, the Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights would photograph an airfield brimming with activity. And when dusk returned, the crew sprinted back into the fields, yanked the plugs, and watched their planes collapse into piles of rubber. Because if the fake squadron didn't leave for a mission, German analysts might grow suspicious. It was performance art, under fire. One soldier later joked, "We were the only unit in the U.S. Army trained to paint shadows." But the humor masked a sobering truth. These men were operating dangerously close to the real front line, and their only defense against strafing runs was to dive behind the very balloons they built. A bullet could deflate their illusion, and them along with it. Yet every day, they inflated the planes again. And every day, another German pilot risked his life to photograph a threat that wasn't there. June 5, 1944, the night before the largest amphibious invasion in history. Every honest soldier prepared to land on Normandy. The deceivers prepared to land everywhere else. Just after midnight, the moonlit skies above northern France filled with aircraft, not carrying elite paratroopers, but dummies. They were called Rupert paradummies, human-shaped sacks of burlap stuffed with straw, boots, and a tiny explosive charge set to ignite upon landing. From the ground, they looked like hundreds of Allied troops dropping behind German lines. Shots rang out, alarms blared, commanders screamed orders into radios. German forces scrambled toward the fake landings, away from the real beaches. And then came the second illusion. Alongside the falling dummies, loudspeaker teams descended. Real men carrying massive audio equipment. They hid in hedgerows and blasted the sounds of troops shouting, gear clanking, and vehicles rumbling. To the panicked German defenders, it sounded like a full division assembling in the dark. Operation Titanic had done its job. Turned German fear into German confusion. While the enemy rushed to plug phantom invasions, the real paratroopers secured bridges and roads for the Normandy landings. Far from the chaos, balloon crews in England kept inflating their planes and trucks, sending fake radio transmissions to reinforce the lie. More forces assembling near Dover for the next strike. Hitler's generals soon became convinced. Normandy was not the main attack. It was a distraction. The true invasion, they believed, would come at Calais. And to prove it, they had photographs. Photographs of rubber planes and dummy airfields crafted by men with paint-stained hands. The world's most powerful war machine was taking orders from balloons and scarecrows. And the success of D-Day now depended on how long the illusion could hold. With the distraction of Operation Titanic in full swing, the artists of war prepared their next grand illusion. A phantom air force ready to dominate the skies. It began in the fields around Dover and Kent. Entire farms were turned into airfields overnight. The locals would wake to the sight of fresh runways carved into pastures, hangars rising where cows once grazed, and rows of fighter bombers gleaming under the sun. At least, that's what it looked like. The truth was far stranger. Each plane was built of rubber skins stretched over metal frames. They were inflated with air compressors, inspected, and positioned with military precision. Crews painted oil drips beneath engines that didn't exist, and placed dummy ladders for ground checks that would never happen. Even the tire tracks, perfect circles of mud, were carefully carved by hand. To a German scout plane rushing past at 300 miles per hour, it was indistinguishable from reality. And these fake squadrons didn't just sit still. They flew missions. Each morning, dozens of rubber P-47s were left in plain view. By afternoon, they were deflated and hidden, as if they had taken off for combat. After dark, they reappeared in new positions, having supposedly returned from battle. Meanwhile, loudspeaker teams blasted real recordings of engine startups, aircrew chatter, and maintenance clatter. To the Germans listening from across the channel, it sounded like pilots were gearing up for another sortie. Enemy intelligence officers noted the activity, circled the sites on maps, and urged counterattacks. Even Hitler himself received updates about these phantom airfields, and reacted just as the Allies hoped, by strengthening defenses away from Normandy. One Allied officer later said, "We fought the Luftwaffe with balloons, and they never figured it out." But the closer the ghost crews moved toward France, the more dangerous the charade became. And soon, the Luftwaffe would respond. With real bullets. By late summer 1944, the fighting had crossed the beaches and was surging deep into France. The balloon crews followed, now setting up decoy airfields within firing distance of German artillery and patrols. Their new orders were blunt. You will draw fire away from the real airfields. They weren't acting anymore. They were acting as targets. Ground crews inflated their rubber aircraft under tree lines, always listening for the distant growl of approaching fighters. Every hiss of air felt like a countdown to discovery, and that discovery finally came. One afternoon, a German reconnaissance plane circled too long, the pilot having noticed something strange about the shadows cast on the ground. Minutes later, the whistle of incoming fire screamed down from the clouds. Explosions tore through the field. Chunks of flaming canvas flew into the air. The inflatable fleet deflated into smoking heaps. The deception, men dove into ditches, clutching nothing more than shovels and canvas tarps for protection. They had no real weapons. Their guns were props. Their tanks were balloons. Their courage was real. When the raid ended, the survivors pulled themselves out of puddles and smoke. They dusted off the mud. And then, they returned to work. Because the German aircraft that bombed them had just wasted fuel and ammunition. On lies. And while the Luftwaffe was busy attacking a field full of air, the real Allied air forces, just miles away, remained untouched and ready to strike. The balloon crews didn't celebrate. There was no victory cheer for nearly dying under fake wings. But as they patched and reinflated new aircraft, they understood something profound. Their survival wasn't the point. Their illusion was. And every time the enemy fired at rubber, real men lived to fight another day. The turning point came as the Allies prepared for a massive strike deeper into France. The Luftwaffe, though battered, still had sharp claws. When they spotted large Allied air activity, they attacked quickly, violently, and without mercy. So the deception teams crafted one of their boldest illusions yet. A dummy airbase built directly in the Luftwaffe's crosshairs. Within 48 hours, the base appeared. 40 rubber fighter planes, canvas fuel depots, fake ammunition stacks, truck convoys drawn in chalk on dirt roads. And through loudspeakers, the sounds of a bustling squadron burst into the night. Engines roaring, crewmen shouting, metal clanging. German spotters listened, and they bit. At dawn, the deception unit heard the distant howl of approaching engines. Not one, but many. Messerschmitts screamed down in a tight attack pattern. Bombs fell. Cannons spat fire. The earth shook as explosions ripped apart the airfield. The Germans pulled away feeling satisfied. Another Allied air force crippled on the ground. But what they destroyed was nothing more than rubber, rope, and clever illusions. 10 miles away, the real American fighter groups sat untouched on real runways. Engines warming, pilots ready. When the Luftwaffe circled back hours later expecting to dominate the sky, they flew into a wall of real steel and fire. Outnumbered, unprepared, and unaware they had been duped, the Germans lost planes they could not afford to lose. One Ghost Army veteran would later recall, "Those pilots should have been bombing our boys. Instead, they bombed balloons." It wasn't just a clever trick, it was a strategic victory. Every German bomb dropped on a dummy target was one less dropped on a real fighter squadron. Every German plane shot down in panic was one less terrorizing Allied troops on the front. On that day, a balloon army held back Hitler's air force, and won. When the shooting finally faded across Europe, the balloon crews packed up their canvas aircraft one last time. There were no headlines for them, no victory parades. They rolled up their rubber planes, boxed the loudspeakers, and folded the props like stagehands after a theater show. Their field of battle, illusions. Their reward, anonymity. Official reports credited fighter squadrons, generals, and infantry divisions, but not the men who had convinced Hitler that threats lurked where none existed. The deception units were disbanded quietly, their work buried under top-secret stamps. Their families never knew the danger they had lived through, or the lives they had saved. Many returned to their civilian trades, Some went back to advertising agencies and art studios. Others built houses, designed billboards, painted portraits. When asked what they did in the war, they answered the only way they were allowed. A little of this, a little of that. The truth, that they had crafted some of the most effective deceptions in military history, remained locked away. Yet behind closed doors, among the soldiers who knew, their reputation was legend. They fought with imagination. Every mission they completed meant fewer bombs falling on Allied troops, fewer aircraft ambushed in the sky, fewer names written into casualty lists. They had been asked to risk their lives not by firing upon the enemy, but by convincing the enemy to fire on them. And they did it willingly, knowing their victories could never be spoken aloud. In a world celebrating heroes with medals and monuments, they became something rarer. Heroes who received neither, and served anyway. More than 50 years passed before the truth finally surfaced. Declassified documents revealed the impossible. Inflatable planes, dummy runways, and stage props had helped defeat the greatest military threat the world had ever known. Historians were stunned. Veterans were speechless. And those quiet men who had once painted rubber wings and carved fake tire tracks? They were suddenly recognized as pioneers of modern warfare. One of the balloon soldiers, long retired, stood in front of a restored decoy aircraft on display and whispered, "I never thought anyone would believe this story. Because deception, done right, is invisible. Today, military forces around the world still use inflatable decoys, fake fighter jets in the desert, dummy missile launchers designed to fool satellites, phantom tank columns hidden beneath camouflage nets. All of it can be traced back to the artists who went to war with scissors, glue, and courage. They proved that imagination, when wielded with precision, could stop armies, redirect fleets, and rewrite the map of a continent. Their legacy isn't marked by craters or ruins, but by the absence of them. No one will ever know exactly how many lives were saved because Hitler attacked airfields filled with balloons instead of steel. But the math is simple. Every German bomb dropped on a dummy plane was a bomb that didn't kill a real pilot. In a war defined by destruction, they saved lives through illusion. And long after the rubber tanks rotted and the inflatable planes deflated into history, the stories of these invisible heroes remain. Proof that sometimes the bravest soldiers aren't the ones who fire the shots, but the ones who convince the enemy to fire at nothing at all.